Sure. My name is Mike German. I'm a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. Prior to that, I was a lobbyist with the American Civil Liberties Union, and prior to that, for 16 years, I was an FBI special agent.
What methods do you think intelligence agencies should use to guide policy recommendations concerning issues of national security?
So I think the primary goal of the national security establishment should be to protect all Americans. Unfortunately, the way they tend to look at it is they look at some Americans as suspects and protect some of us from the rest of us. And I think what they need to do is understand security as an issue where there are very few people who do harm, and focus all their efforts on those few people rather than treating us all as suspects. And the key to that is public accountability, and that's where I think the biggest failure is that these agencies have virtually no public accountability. What little accountability they have takes place behind closed doors, and we don't have the opportunity as citizens to evaluate whether what they're doing is good for our communities or not good for our communities.
How do you think digital technology and social media have affected civil rights and civil rights movements?
It's, in some ways, digital technology has greatly assisted civil rights. We can use our voices much more broadly. Everybody can publish their own information. We can get our voices out there. But the way the intelligence communities have looked at this is with fear, and they have addressed it through mass surveillance and throttling or censoring speech or targeting speech for investigative activity. And that's part of the problem, is that rather than focusing on bad actors, they focus on people who say things that frighten them, usually things that are challenging the establishment. And the way social change happens is by challenging the establishment. So it turns the focus of the national security establishment away from people who are doing harm to people who are actually trying to do good by changing a status quo that's not protective of everyone.
How do you believe the FBI's expanding surveillance system is affecting our society, specifically the youth? How can we as young people preserve our civil rights in an expanding surveillance government?
So I think the FBI has created a problem. Immediately after 9/11, they scapegoated Muslims in a way that divided American society, where rather than seeing everyone as working together to build one society, we started looking at each other as suspects. And that is a huge part of the problem, because once you condition your way of thinking to believe that whole communities are responsible for the bad acts of a few, it's easier to do that with other groups. And what we saw shortly after that is what they call their racial and ethnic mapping program, which is exactly that, where they have these crude stereotypes that certain communities commit certain kinds of crime, and that then justifies mass surveillance of those communities. So that has, I think, accelerated the divide that is roiling our society now, where we have so much racial tension. It is somewhat supported by the, well, if the FBI is afraid of these groups, then of course it's reasonable for me to be afraid of these groups. So I think it has damaged our society in dangerous ways. And I do think also that the secrecy the FBI and the entire intelligence community works through is very dangerous, because it undermines our confidence in those institutions as protecting our rights. And once we lose confidence in the institutions, particularly law enforcement institutions that are supposed to be protecting us, we tend to look to people to protect us. And I think that's what has driven the increasing authoritarianism in the United States and really throughout Europe, that once you have a situation where Western nations can justify torture in defense of certain concerns that they have, then the rule of law starts to break down, and once the rule of law breaks down, none of us are protected by it. So that I think the situation we're in today is the result of 15, almost 20 years of that now. As far as what the youth can do, organize, and work together, right? I think all the different communities, it started out where it was okay to target the Muslim communities and then Latino communities because they were immigrants, and that creates some social tension. So once you start moving from one group to another, it's easy to target one at a time. So as activists, what we have to do is make sure that we're working together, so when any one community is attacked, all of us recognize that that's an attack on us. And that way we can create a mass of resistance to these methods and work locally, right? It's very important. The FBI is not an institution that is very available to local activists, right? But your local representatives are, your local police chief is. And if you can go and address them about your concerns about the FBI and use them as a bulwark against the FBI, and I'll talk about this a little bit today, but part of this is to try and do the opposite of what happened during the Civil Rights Movement. In the Civil Rights Movement, you had recalcitrant state and local governments who were resistant to the law and trying to not obey the laws that were being passed, the civil rights laws. So the federal government had to come in and compel them to do that. Where today, what we have is a federal government that's not paying attention to the law and not protecting American communities. So it's up to our local and state representatives to protect us. And we're seeing that happening around the country. So I think that's very important that we start protecting each community protects itself, and then we start working together and expanding that to resist the federal government's attempts to take away any of our rights.